Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 120. Only 300 more to our magic number. That's going to be, in my calculations, about 10 years at this rate. Although I am going to try and speed up some episodes moving into the winter, trying to get 2 a week, as we did, I think, in previous winters. It becomes a lot easier when people don't have kids to look after and all of their jobs and other daytime responsibilities. I'm not going to mention the weather this week. I know I do every bloody week, but it's just too depressing. It's just too depressing. I know the world is on fire right now, and I am sorry for that, and I have great sympathy and empathy. But I haven't seen the sun in quite a while in the north, so it was wonderful to get away this weekend at Product Earth. We had one wet day, 2 very dry, beautiful days. Great attendance, good numbers, brilliant different stalls and exhibitors from around the country, around the world even. We had some guys fly out from Cali, which was pretty fun. We had some of the guys out from Barcelona and from the club scene down there, which was awesome. Beautiful panels in terms of the diversity of the conversations that were had. There was a lot of new information that was presented by different organizations. And I think for the first time in many years, a consensus was found, well, at least on the panels that I participated in, which will be available very soon as the MPK guys, as you may have seen with Stephen Brooks in last week's episode. They've filmed everything that happened at Product Earth. So there will be plenty for you guys to catch up on if you couldn't make it. But yeah, thank you to everyone that called by the stall and said hello and whatnot. Very much enjoyed the crack as always. Very overstimulating. Had hundreds of conversations, but enjoyed every single one of them. Great to interact with the public and to get out of this tiny room and feel like there's a bigger world out there. So appreciate everyone coming up and saying they listen to the podcast and they appreciate the work that I do, because it can feel quite lonely in this little room. Right up, coming soon to thesimpalife.com. Do check it out. And without further ado, we'll move on to today's guest, who is a UK-based plant scientist specialising in molecular genetics. I do apologise, folks. I've got a cold, as you can probably hear. They're the Chief Scientific Officer at Pharma Seeds, and they are the Chair of the CIC, which is the Cannabis Industry Council Plant Science Working Group, as well as a contributing author to the Cannabis Health and Cannabis Wealth magazines. They are Dr. Gary Yates. How are you doing, brother?
Yes, I'm very well, Simpa. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on. I've been kind of looking forward to this for some time. I think we had a swing and a miss getting me on before, so I'm glad to finally get here and get into the bones of what's happening in our crazy industry.
Indeed. I think I need to send Microsoft an email. It seems my website address is still getting flagged. I think I end up in the spam boxes with all of those, "Oh, I'm so horny" emails that we all seem to find getting hundreds of, or is that just me? I don't know. If maybe not. Who knows? Maybe I've just outed myself there. But I've had the same email address for about 20 years, so that could explain some shit right there. So did absolutely crash this off a cliff. Let's get back on track. For people that don't know you, sort of when and how did you first get involved in cannabis?
Professionally speaking.
Well, we're on the record, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, you can allegedly when you first personally got involved, but
it's probably worth mentioning that it's a very typical story. Like as a kid, as a teenager, you're exposed to these things, and especially more so in certain communities than others. And coming from a very working class background in West Central Scotland, it was something that was readily available in every other household. You could not avoid it if you tried. And the funny thing was that my experience of it back then was very much a dividing line as it is now. In some respects, it was the people who thought it was the absolute devil, and then people who revered it really highly. And a lot of them in those communities abused it, though, at the same time. And although you could draw a line under what is abuse and what is, heavy medication, I think it's quite an interesting thing. But that's what kicked it off, essentially. The next big milestone for me was during a trip to Amsterdam as an adult, mid-20s, tried psilocybin as a heavy dose for the first time, and made the realization whilst there that not only did I want to study genetics, but actually one of the driving things for me into that line of study was, why does this plant do what it does and no other plants tend to do that? It was like as simple an observation as, why is this plant so unique in that respect? And then after that trip, within a year, I was studying genetics at Glasgow University. And then my career path took me right down genetics, then into molecular biology, focusing on plant science, plant pathogen interactions, studied wheat and rice and maize and all sorts of things like that. At Durham, actually, which is something we should come back to. And then and then worked as a researcher at York University, and then entered into the industry proper around 2020. So it was basically straight into this job. Brought in as someone who would lead a breeding program, do a bit of R&D, and basically be the kind of figurehead for the knowledge base of the plant and its outputs. And that job's taken me in all sorts of different twists and turns. As a startup, Pharma Seeds was never fully established when I came in, and most other companies in this space as well. There's the industry's been slow to move over the last 3 years in a lot of respects. So it's been challenging in that respect. But that's given me exposure to lots of other sides of the industry which I didn't expect to get upon the interview of this job, if you know what I mean, which was then working with the sister company Seedsman and doing a lot more stuff with the recreational cannabis in the US and things like that, which again, you know what it's like in the UK climate. It's very faux pas sometimes to talk about recreational use and things like that. And I found all that stuff really weird, because you can't have a complete conversation without filling in all the blanks. It's a super important facet, because again, my first entry into it, although you can put on the PhD and the doctor title and say you're a plant scientist, it's not. I was smoking weed on the street corners as like a 15-year-old. That's the reality of most of our entry to cannabis, and it can't and shouldn't really be ignored. It's something that we should be able to talk about without really being marginalised for that kind of thing, because it's how we know the plant, because of the prohibition that's come before us. That's what we were forced to do to experience the plant. And I'm not saying it's the best way to be introduced to the plant, but it's certainly, again, something that we've all experienced.
Yeah. Just going on to that last point there, I would agree that there is a drawing line in the UK between the people who kind of grew up and experienced the legacy culture and cannabis under prohibition, and those that have experienced cannabis only as a private prescription medication here in the UK for the past sort of 5 years. And there seems to be quite a roughing, like an incompatibility in a lot of circles between these two entities, because of a lack of humility on both sides, of an inability to understand the other, that a lot of the people that are coming into this space since the law has changed don't understand that all of the great work that they are doing also occurred under legacy, that actually most of the knowledge that was acquired, most of the techniques were perfected under prohibition. And it just seems that there is this growing gulf between these two realities. As you say, that there is this taboo around, if you want to call it recreational or adult use, or, non-medicinal consumption, however we want to sort of term it, that it's so individualized that, this is something that we probably will get onto, or we could just get onto now, if there's something in the preamble we discussed of the idea of cannabis flower being prescribed is in abstract an incredibly insane thing when you really understand the biology, the botany, the taxonomy of the plant, its expressions, and the necessity of the pharmacological paradigm to have single symptom managing single compounds. And cannabis just doesn't seem to want to fit into these boxes. All that we know prior to the law change, new legislation around medicinal access, again, came from whole plant. So there are so many entities out there that are now saying, oh, it's CBD this, it's THC this, or it's this cannabinoid, this compound. And we're just, again, it feels we're golfing too fast, that there is this line where anything before that, and that's not real, it's not to be trusted. We can only trust now the academic scholastic data that has then arisen since, which again is based off everything that has been. But there seems to be that gulf,
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why it's kind of confusing for me why it's been allowed, the cannabis flower has been prescribed. Because here's the first exposure I ever got, maybe like 20 years ago, of cannabis being used in a very therapeutic way. And I'm sorry for the vagueness of this reference, right? But maybe not 20 years ago, because it was on YouTube, but it was early days of YouTube, right? And what it was some young girl, and she had some kind of muscle issue, and her dad grew plants and he juiced them and he fed her raw juice every day, and she was fully mobile and fully able to function with the juiced cannabis plant, but without it, she was bedbound. And I remember looking at that and going, whoa, that's like, what the hell? We're sitting here burning it, and then this is life-saving medicine as a basically as a smoothie, right? And then fast forward to my entry to the industry in 2020, one of the things that I quickly realised, based on not a lot, but a few really detailed patient cases, was the cannabinoid acids are way more therapeutic than the industry gives them credit for. I think they're essential. I think it justifies a lot of the behaviour of consumption in some respects as well. But back to the point was the fact that cannabis flower juice is not available on prescription, but cannabis flower for vaporizing is, for me, is a juxtaposition, because I was only in the industry a few months when I realised the value of the cannabinoid acids, which I didn't realise before. I started properly focusing on the study of the plant and what it did at that point. But that also involves speaking to people. This was the people who were on the NHS prescriptions, but also people who had to self-farm and self-administer. And that was where most of the insight came from on the cannabinoid acids, because they can't get those by prescription. And that's what they had realised is the valuable part of the medicine. So, I think we're, again, not getting the best out of the plant, not only because we're overlooking that, but because the fact that, sorry, I'm jumping around a wee bit, Simpa, because I wanted to insert into that conversation people's ability to grow their own plants freshly juiced would solve a lot of problems, I think, in respects of prescription cannabis. And I don't know why it's not more seriously considered. I don't know why it's, again, one of those things, no, you can't mention that. Don't bring that up because you'll just be shunned. And it's just like, but it's so essential to the argument,
It's yeah. I think one of the reasons we can't have that conversation the same with patients growing their own comes down to a consequence of either an willful ignorance, an oversight, or true malice within the creation of the legislation. Anybody sitting around on Google for a day or two, really trying to deep dive, and going beyond what is just the surface level of bullshit, will very quickly start to get access to information in academic spheres about what cannabis is, about what it can do, about the endocannabinoid system and what that truly is. And because of the unique nature and profile of our endocannabinoid systems, the standardization that is required of modern pharmacology just will not happen with cannabis, even with single compounds, CBD or THC. The variance in it is massive. There are so many, the variables around it are massive. So they don't want to have these conversations about it, because then if we look at it, okay, if it's not then a specific thing in the same way other pharmacology works, what is it? And I would say that it comes down to a statement that I probably haven't said in a while, so this might not come out correct. But cannabis is an essential vitamin and nutrient. It's a base requirement for essential human health. It is no different than an amino acid or a vitamin or mineral. I think if we look at cannabis like that, it's effectively like we just found out about scurvy. And what we've done is gone, oh, dudes, if you extract from oranges, right, and this, and we can sell them this when they get sick. No, we've identified it's not working. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's personally is the greatest lie of medical, if you want to call it medical or medicinal cannabis, is that it has to be this kind of, oh no, here and there. It'll work ubiquitously across the board for anybody. It's almost like, it's going to bad language, bad science, almost like a stem cell, as it were, or like a filler. It just fills into the system where it needs. If you're taking that kind of full plant extract, you will then, the same with vitamins, you'll just piss away what you don't need, as it were. And having the non-psychoactive element means we can't control it as a drug because it's not psychoactive. So that means everybody would have access to it. So it has to be a psychoactive drug, because then we have to control it, which means we have to limit it, which means, we have to profit from it.
Yeah.
In my opinion, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, like, the fact that you have such a variable output as well, like, I mean, how am I trying to say this, right? So quickly just explain a little bit about the physiology of the plant, right? Like, if you leave a plant to grow to its natural architecture, as in you don't top it, you don't tie it down or anything like that, you'll tend to find the gradient, top to bottom, changes in cannabinoid levels, changes in terpene levels, usually with the most lit parts of the plant producing higher amounts of overall compounds, compared to the undersides of the plants. But that's not a strict rule either. is very much a microenvironment reaction that the plant has. It's highly variable, way more variable than any of those other plants or species that I've studied anyway. That does not seem even close. The only other comparable species is humans and their adaptability, which is interesting. But the point I wanted to make is the endocannabinoid system is basically like the master switch for homeostasis. The homeostasis is the governing system that keeps everything and all the other systems in balance, right? So what you're saying is comparing it to a vitamin or a nutrient, it's actually really, really accurate, because when you enhance your body's ability to self-regulate, you're going to get a more lubricated and working system. And I think what I can sense for you straight away is something that I've found with my use is I do find that makes me function a lot better. I'm a better version of myself, and when I don't have it, I think that feels more like a deprivation of an essential nutrient than something like I really need, like I'm missing because it's like addiction. It's not like that at all. And I think that's something that's, again, overlooked, is the value in just peace of being. Because how do you're getting it for pain, you're getting it for anxiety, but no, it's like it can be more subtle. There's gaps in between the lines that, although it doesn't necessarily have, because it doesn't stem from a known medical condition, doesn't mean to say that it's not medically benefiting the user. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Entirely, yeah.
Yeah, and I think so that was one point. And then the second point on the biochemistry itself, what I quickly realised in various studies, when you do, you've got a isolated molecule like THC and you're putting it into a system like a mouse, and then you're watching what happens to those, to the reaction to that, or whether you're doing it in an in vitro system where you're trying to see how much binding affinity it has of this receptor of that. The problem with those experiments, as great as they are, and a lot of molecular biology is it fails to account for the changes that the other substances would make to that interaction. And although they might not necessarily increase binding or decrease binding affinity, they might modulate the way the receptor works in ways that, again, are not yet documented. And I'll give you an example of that without being too kind of wedging in one of my achievements, right? But I worked in plant pathogen interactions during my PhD at Durham, and we were looking at the interface between bacteria and the surface of the plant. Now, whenever the plant detects the little mechanism on bacteria that allows it to swim, the flagella, whenever those things come into contact, the plant immediately mounts an immune response. Okay, there's a cascade of signaling molecules that build into this big full body response, full plant response. Now, they overlooked one of the components to that, which I studied, which was called simulation, right? So this is a modification to that receptor, which then results in a kind of side chain of signaling. Now, that's in plant pathogen interactions and plant immunology is like one of the most studied things in plants. It's a highly competitive and really, really well scrutinized subject. Endocannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system is not, And so what we don't know about that would probably fill the Grand Canyon. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's so many levels of what we don't know. And that's the thing. So I come along and I find that little kind of signaling mechanism that was missed doesn't change the overall story, but it's still kind of important to how things work and how other modifiers are playing a part in pathways that we didn't even know were involved in that. And I think that's what some of the terpenoids and things must be doing. They must be modulating these receptors in different ways, or changing downstream effects, or things like that. And again, it would take £25 million a year for 25 years to try and answer that, because the minutiae, as you say, the individual plant has a series of compounds, but each part of the plant has a different ratio, and then each human is different in the way that they're made up, their diets and the amount of sleep and all that stuff affects how your system works. So it just gets to the complete uncontrollable variables. You just cannot account for everything. But it's crazy though, because the solution is, well, just consume the plant to the way that you're encouraged to do so instinctively. That's what it kind of boils down to,
Mm. Very interesting points. Very, very interesting. And yeah, I always say to people, it's let your nose guide you. You know, it's the same with like food. You know, when you sat there, there's a bodybuilder. I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head. I think is it the Irish guy who said it? The big vegan lad. And he was like, I don't even weigh anything. I don't take what I know what I need. If I need more salt, boom. If I need this vitamin, I take it. It's if you're getting tuned to yourself, you don't need to regiment it and follow it in the same way as I sit here as a prescription holder. You know, obviously my combustion nullifies that prescription, but that isn't from that prescription, luckily. But the point is that I am prescribed it because they recognize a benefit from it. I don't get the benefit from their method of consumption, so I choose my own method of consumption, which does give me the benefit, but that then criminalizes me. So it just, the idea that system can limit it is an absurdity to me. I mean, you speak of one of the things through experimentation, and it's one of the points that I've made for quite a while, and I got very heavily berated by a lot of people, predominantly CBD companies, when I started to point out a few studies that, again, were just asking the question, okay, in vitro experimentation on signaling and da-da-da, you've got X, Y, Z. What happens when you scale that up into a human active system? How does the endocannabinoid system interact with the modulation of other neurotransmitters? You know, how does that interact with hormones? How does that interact with, do you know what I mean? And it's those systems. So there's various studies came to the conclusion that CBD is a non-psychoactive, but actually CBD in an active system will affect these peripheral systems. It will modulate mood. It will give you psychoactive effects. It's just not classified or characterized in the same way as THC. So then you get this binary marketing of THC psychoactive, bad, CBD non-psychoactive, good.
Yeah, I experienced that the first time I taken a dose of CBD. I was like, I can feel an effect in this that was not supposed to be there. Mm-hmm. But secondly, just to back that point up, I think it's really funny because back in those days when you first exposed to cannabis, it was always with us, because we're in the UK, right? It was like tobacco joints, right? Which is interesting because they'd also like their tobacco joints with hash in Spain, right? And recently over at Spanibus, I had a tobacco joint for the first time in ages. And what was crazy about it is that the psychoactive effect from the nicotine, right? Although it's very short-lived, if you don't smoke and you smoke even just a cigarette, you will feel dizzy and queasy and sick and slightly elevated in some way. There's maybe a good element in there somewhere, but it's masked with a lot of crap as well. But that's never written up as that, right? It's never because obviously you nullify that effect by consuming more and more, and then you no longer get that effect. And that's why we have, people have tolerance breaks with cannabis as well, because a similar thing can happen where you can kind of overindulge to the point where, you're needing more and more to get the same kind of effects. And it is worth taking a break for that respect. But the downside of that is sometimes it then makes you too high after the break. I find that, like if you have a break and then that first day or two is like, wow, this is like crazy. But it's good because you reduce your consumption. And because my thing with cannabis as well, like, it's been a long time since I've wanted to get wasted. Do you know what I mean? Like that's not really, it's a kind of, maybe I don't know. I do it to function better. Like that's the thing. I do have, back and hip issues, which, much without it in my system, I'm in pain a lot. With it in my system, it's ignorable,
You're functional.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference and I think it's one of the things we're slowly coming down to, but obviously the power of the opioid lobby is unbelievable. The power of the pharmaceutical industrial complex is unbelievable. Yeah. But they are starting to understand more and more that basically, cannabis doesn't work on the neural pathways in the same way that opioids do, in terms of it just fucking severs the link between you and the pain. Pain is still there. You're going to go about your daily life, putting yourself in more pain, exacerbating the injuries because you're not aware of it. Every signal, good and bad, depression, anxiety, sudden fear, that moment where you're like, what the fuck? And a bus flies past. All of these instinctive things are there to protect us. We are one very complex system made up of tens of trillions of bacterial fucking cells and all the rest of it. And everything is signaling, trying to get you to fucking do what you can to better your body and your health. Whereas then when you consume cannabis, you still have exactly that awareness. You're not suddenly going to go play as a goalkeeper because you can't feel your fucking back. So there's something there that it modulates. Cannabis is an enhancer. It gets in your system and it goes, oh, this guy's got knuckle pain. We'll get rid of that. Oh, he's not sleeping. Boom, we'll fix that. And the broader you can access the spectrum of compounds within the plant, the better your body is at finding these things. And as you said before, like getting wasted, it's been a very long time since I've felt wasted, as it were. And the times that I will, it's like taking a gram of Feco for health reasons or whatever. I'm not in a very good place at all. I'm struggling with aches, pains, not sleeping or whatever. And it's just kind of as a reset. I'm going to overdose my body on cannabinoids and I'm going to, restart that system. And then the first day I usually find a bit grog, but then once I've got sort of through that, everything is generally better and my consumption then goes down, because instead of me seeking it from sort of constant top-ups with a blunt or whatever, it's kind of there latent already. I mean, I make my own tinctures, take them as well as a form of regulation alongside of it. But it's the interesting point you made of tobacco. I brought this up in an article I wrote for Weed World about driving many years ago, of saying that, if you, as a non-tobacco consumer, say you've been at a house party or whatever, or you've been somewhere and you just ran out of baccy and it's been nearly 20 hours since you've had a cigarette, and you get in that car and smoke a cigarette, your tolerance drops fast. For the not nicotine, coatine, I think is what we derive from it. And it's such a sensitivity to it that when you suddenly get it again, exactly as you say, you can get dizzy, you get that kind of, when you fall back into yourself sensation, people start getting really sweaty, anxious, your heart gets tachycardic. And for a few seconds to a minute or two, it can be quite a difficult experience. Whereas then somebody who consumes cannabis all day, every fucking day, normally for whatever condition X, Y, or Z, and they have their awareness and tolerance and knowledge of how they drive and maneuver, them then not accessing that cannabis prior to getting in that vehicle, it falls into a dangerous state. So we're just in this weird juxtaposition of things, of how we're told that these things are so simplistic, and it's really not. I mean, I could sit and smoke an ounce in a day and literally still be sat chatting to people. I could watch people go through a gram blunt and they'd be asleep in the lap. Yeah. And it's not anybody's fault, as it were. And to then try and artificially regulate these systems, I think it's just bullshit. It's arbitrary bullshit.
Yeah, it's always on a worst case scenario, but those same kind of considerations are not applied to alcohol, not applied to tobacco, they're not applied to prescription. Well, that's a lie. They're applied to prescription drugs. But I mean, even things like, and please, we'll need to fact check this, but I'm sure at some point since legalization in Colorado, there was some statistic about how driving incidents had reduced. And one of the biggest arguments I think that the opposition had there was that, the increased use is going to lead to a lot more road accidents. And I think there is actually evidence to the contrary of that. I'm sure there is. Are you looking that up now, or?
Yeah. Well, this is a NCBI. Obviously, we have to take that with a certain amount of pinch of salt. I know, obviously, you're an academic and work in the spheres. I'm not going to obviously go into my personal feelings, but
we should mention something about the academic papers on cannabis, because there's a lot of them I've been appalled by.
Please do, because there's a few investigations happening at a few universities in America and schools where they're starting to find serious anomalies, not just in cannabis, but in just general academic peer-reviewed papers in general, that are often really supportive of huge industries, highly profitable industries, and it's almost like the paperwork is thrown through.
Yeah, and it's also with papers on, especially in plants, to do with the plant itself and the peer-reviewed literature, because it's hard to find an academic expert who knows what the optimal growing conditions for medical grade cannabis is, right? They just on a superficial level, they don't know. So how can you peer review it to the same standard when none of the academics understand the particulars? Because that's what I noticed in one I can't remember what's the name of it, I'll try and look it up, but in one quite big paper that's well cited, the growing conditions of these plants were absolutely appalling. I don't think they put the temperature above 20 degrees, but they never justified that in the text in any way. And I'm sure it was the same temperature all the way through. And having worked in academic labs and grow rooms, I know it's probably because there was other plants in there and that's what the temperature they needed to be, and they just had to do the experiment in that same space. Do you see what I mean? So they've not actually grown the plants out under optimal conditions, which isn't necessarily a requirement, but you've got to get close to what even the commercial growers are doing. Do you know what I mean? They're never going to be growing plants at 20 degrees all the way through, because you just won't get the same rate of cannabinoid production.
Again, if you know the taxonomy of the plant, it's THC is basically the sunscreen of the plant. So the more you kind of increase that, the higher THC yield is a general kind of rule of thumb. Obviously, there's a hell of a lot of nuance in the science there. There was a bit of bro science from me. I probably shouldn't have done that. But as a general kind of concept, that holds to be true.
Sorry, Simpa, can I interject? Because it backs up what you just said, and it puts a hammer on the point. One of the papers that came out in the last year was something about how UVA or UVB makes no impact on the THC production. Mm-hmm. And the way they had done this experiment is they had given it a 1 hour dose of UV each day, which I could not for the life of me fathom. Because if you want to you want to see the effect of a light spectrum on a plant, you kind of have to leave it on. You know, at least as a side control, let's leave one on all the way through. But the problem is, I think, as you say, there's influence here, and there's people with agendas that are funding some of this research, because it's never ever seen one plant studied so much privately as well in the academic circles. So those funders, they must be up to something, because what I noticed is, why would you not run a constant UV supply control? Because that must have shown that it upped the levels. Because even Kyle Esplin, who's a mutual friend, he often cites the fact that there was some correspondence from India and Scotland over different cannabinoid-based medicines from 1850 or something like this. And they had stated in the correspondence that plants growing up the mountain were more therapeutic than those grown in the valley. And the most measurable difference there would be the intensity of the UV. You know, that would be what would most likely affect the cannabinoid production in that sense. So I think you were spot on in what you said in two respects there, the UV and the academic, not being as true to, you know, what we would believe it to be, because it really did shake my confidence in the peer review system, which was solid when I left the academic realm. When I came into the cannabis, I was like, whoa. No. This is clearly a case of there's no experts here, so they're just pulling people at random to review this almost, and that will do. You know, so there's a problem with that. There's a real problem with that.
Yeah, I think there's obviously something you yourself will have found as well, that attachment of certain names gives a much higher cachet and quality to whatever it is that is being claimed. So people think, I don't want to go against this individual. I don't want to go against, the potential paymasters, alleged paymasters of some of these individuals. So again, I'm not going to make any aspersions, but this has become common practice. You know, we have legalized bribery through lobbying, but within the academic circles, we have that through funding. So basically, if you don't, come to a certain preconceived conclusion through your study, you might not get that extra grant for your new music hall or whatever. There's a lot of politics and bullshit that kind of goes along with it. And you make the interesting point again, this cannabis is probably one of the, if not the most studied plant in human history. And at least previously there was an open forum for all. There was a hell of a lot of classism, race issues, structural issues, socioeconomic issues with the past, just in isolation in terms of academia. It was more open. Even though, it was to a smaller group of people. But the point was still the profiting from patent creation, etc., was secondary. The pursuit of knowledge was primary. And that seems to be lost from cannabis. It seems that they have made up their conclusions based on what is best to limit the market for their monopoly, their conglomerate to profit most.
I think that having a look at where the industry is now, is quite clearly a divided community. Like, so even on the legal front, where you've got people like yourself and people like Connor, who's doing something else slightly on the legitimate side, but he's still part of the community. He's got a voice for the community. We have that side of the voice, and then we've got the other side, which is that it's a way that, well, we need to move money into this, and if people are going to put money in, they need to get money back out. That's the only way we're going to move it forward and all this. Now, my feeling is that we are hurtling towards a massive. Let me word it another way. If you go through the UK prescription method, right, you might quickly realise that actually the knowledge which we think is highly regulated and it's really, everything pins on if you say this, you're going to get that. If you're going to, that is not really how that system works from the inside at all. It's not all based on individual biology and needs. It's based on what's available and some degree of not want, but want from the patient. That's what I think drives that, which means that from a medical standpoint, it's that in itself is kind of invalidated, right? So we've got that element. Then we've got the side of the corporations and the bigger companies who they're using the medical side of things as a way to we'll just sit and wait until it becomes recreational. And that's, what I've seen from inside the industry, that is one of the biggest issues. Is they just, what is it? Do you call it virtue signaling? Is it, when you're basically claiming, shouting about this medical thing, but that's nothing to do with your intention, your belief, or why you're in the game. That was a hard pill to swallow for me because although I wasn't sure what to expect coming into the industry, I genuinely didn't think it was going to be quite as obvious to see those kind of actors in the space, and there's plenty of them. And again, if people want to make money and find a way to do it, that's not the issue. But the issue for me is I feel that even the legalization process, if you want to call it that, sorry for bad choice of words there, but whatever we went through, turning to medical and then what we're trying to achieve as a community going forward, that whole process is just been jaded by actors in the space with prominence who, for me, they're profiteering from the fact that there is limited knowledge and they hold a lot of the keys to that knowledge and they're making money now from that. That was one of the things that really sickened me about the industry, man, was I could see, I identified that really quickly and not a lot of other people are speaking up about it, and it's quite hard for me to speak up about it because of the positions I hold as well. But, being as general as this, I can certainly say that that's something that I've witnessed and something that is prominent. Where does that leave us? I don't know. We've still been lucky in the sense that we don't have Syngenta or Monsanto or any of these big crazy companies, crazy plant companies coming in, and try to sweep up everything. GW's done a fair job at that on its own anyway. But I was that was something I was wanting to ask you is what was your what's your opinion on the whole GW Pharma enterprise and how that's been allowed to be the sole license holder for since 1998 or something like that? I feel there's a challenge there to whoever granted that license.
I'll circle back to the GW thing in a minute because that's going to be a whole point. But in terms of bad faith actors, I don't know why. People invite me places. People put me in all sorts of places. Do you know what I mean? Whether I want to or not, I'll get thrust into Cannabis Europe. I'll get thrust into the launch of this event. I'll get thrust to the launch of whatever. And people don't know me, especially not if you don't know me. Then you really don't know what I stand. You don't know that I'm here truly just seeking knowledge and truth, even to the detriment of my own individual self. And so people talk, and I hear what goes on in these rooms. I'm a party to being CC'd into various emails. I am, an advisor on various things. I still get correspondence. I get fed a lot of information, a lot of internal documents and things like that from various entities. And thank you to everyone that does that. I really appreciate it. That's exactly what I see. When I flew out to America, when I spoke to people, that's exactly what they told me happened. When I went to Canada, said that's exactly what it's the game plan of multinational, huge venture capitalist investment firms. They have such power and influence that they are 2, 3, 4 times removed from what we think is actually happening. And you look at this and go, a grassroots campaign to help the people. It's not. Again, not going to cast any aspersions. I'm not going to cause a fight between anybody else or whatever else, but I fought at the front line of this fight for many years now. I've stood outside Parliament. I fought physically with police. I've screamed in their face. I even made a bunch of coppers cry in London once for arresting Callie Blackwell. I will bring plants with me. I will commit civil disobedience. I will forever stand upon this wherever I go and support anyone that I believe is fighting for me. But I have felt betrayed and lied to, manipulated time and time again by these movements. Because of the people that have the genuine sincerity and the passion and actually are helping hundreds, if not thousands of people, are doing it in silence. They are still just quietly doing what they can wherever they can because they are still at war. And there is this kind of new conglomerate. I call it neo-legalization, to borrow from, say, neo-liberalization, and sort of the liberalism rather. So a newer form, a structured form of what used to be kind of a loose philosophy. So legalization used to be a loose philosophy of individuals. When Pete Tosh and etc. sang about it, they were singing about ending cannabis prohibition. They weren't singing about, Cure Relief and fucking GW and Tilray and all these other multinational conglomerates owning it while Jamaica still isn't free. Do you know what I mean? They weren't singing about these things. They weren't talking about them fighting for regulation, taxation, and all the rest of it. They just wanted to be set free. And so these new neo-legalizationists are often corporate suits, politically connected, from money, from legal, from economics, do you know what I mean, from academic backgrounds, with no offense to yourself or any of the other people that I know with doctrines and academic qualifications. But that gives them this cachet that we should listen to them. And I believe that they have merit and value to add, but unless this is with the culture and alongside of it, you are creating a form of what I call Prohibition 2.0. You are building this legalized system on top of something that doesn't exist. Because ultimately, I make the point that we cannot legalize cannabis because cannabis isn't unlawful or illegal. It's us that are criminalized. The plant has no agency in the same way a knife has no agency. In a kitchen, it's a tool. You chop up your veg. No problem. No one's going to raid you because you've got a drawer full of knives. But if you took that into your waistband and walk out on the street, that's not an illegal action. It's an unlawful action. You are then arrested for unlawful possession of a knife because you lawfully shouldn't possess it in those circumstances. Whereas if you were then a chef and it was in your box and you were on your way to work, you wouldn't have that problem. And those arbitrary restrictions of the law is where we're at with this. And their legalization expands on those loopholes. So if you have a license through prescription, or you have a license for cultivation because you're an air quotes hemp farmer or whatever, and you get to destroy your heads and do what you want with all the products, there's too many loopholes for manipulation when kids on council estates like that you grew up in, that I grew up adjacent to and spent most of my time in, they're still criminalized. They're still demonized as druggies. They're the skunk users. They're the bad guys. And it's just this classist separation where as long as you say, oh, I vaporize and I'm a patient, you're safe and you're fine. But if you're caught smoking a joint somewhere, the number of people, I'll finish this point on the bad actors thing, if I know in the space that will get shy, they're proud on stage, I'm a patient, I'm a whatever, but they smoke joints. But don't ever show me combusting. So how dare you? You are in a position of power. You should use that to speak up for those that cannot. I know obviously I butt heads with some activists on this, but it's my stance in life. I am on the front line. I put myself there and I stand for what I can, where I can. And I believe if others did the same, we'd be able to weed out these bad actors. But it feels like the power, the influence and the money and notoriety, influence, we all know it's the celebrity allure. As soon as they pluck you out of the crowd and put you on the stage and big you up for your story and your narrative, and they help workshop it and give you media training, and all of a sudden you're a mouthpiece for them. The number of mothers I've had on this platform that were part of the two campaigns that, again, I'm not going to name, probably for legal reasons, that have then told me after the fact kind of what actually happened there with the manipulation, how little support they actually got. They were used as media fodder to pass legislation that benefited multinational corporations while they're still paying thousands of pounds a month to fucking help their children access the life-saving medication.
Yeah. And it's like, and that's an example of exactly what, one of the kind of things that hold true. Is it because Britain's so traditionalist? Is it because, but some of these archaic ways that things work, what is really benefiting society, that mother is arrested for, black market, using the black market to source cannabis to treat her severely sick children. Is that a lesser evil than, the child potentially dying? Come on. Where is the room for modern thinking and common sense to be applied? Now, understand at one point you had to draw lines under things, But those lines have blurred for a long time in many facets of the law. It's not just in drugs. Like there's many facets of the law. Look at the way that insurance works or certain financial things. It's like absolutely crazy. You know, the one-way contract, get a mobile phone contract. It's one way, take it or leave it. You don't get to negotiate a contract with a mobile phone company, but the law's in their favour from the start. They can put whatever terms they want on that, and you sign it or you don't. Do you know what I mean? Because it's a crazy way of working. There's no participation from what is essentially providing all the finance, which is the customer. You know, and that's the same as what you're talking about. You're getting penalised for. They're almost getting penalised for bringing this blight to light. You know, and then we'll fix it, but it's going to cost you your mortgage. You know what I mean? Like it's absolutely ludicrous.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, and one other point, just on that whole media thing. I'm a massive UFC fan, right? I really like my cage fighting, and it's been interesting watching, being a 20-year vet of watching that sport, watching the change over legalization in the US states, where you had people like Nick Diaz and more recently Sean O'Malley, who just won a championship, just blunting up after their fights or even during the fight, watching the fights from the sides. You know what I mean? Like, really being advocates, because they've got more similar backgrounds to you and I than they have anything else. And that's funny, because watching that American culture explode in that direction, where that whole thing has been torn down now in recreational out for like in California, Colorado, and the rest. You're just watching those guys who want to break out and do it, just do it. For me, it's like, it's definitely not perfect over there, right? But just that element of it makes me feel like Britain's so last century. You know, it's so stuck in its ways with how it even operates and its speed. And that was the other thing. Sorry, I'm just going on.
It's all good.
The whole COVID thing and how quick we were to react and change things to suit that situation. And in some cases, rightly so, and in some cases, questionably so, right? But the fact that they could act that fast, and then the fact that everything else, like, I would say they could, because, what's his name again? Free, the guy, we've seen him at Brighton.
Free Cannabis.
Yes. He was, I was going to say free weed, but it wasn't sitting right in my head. One of the things that he mentions is something about like a global cannabinoid shortage or deficiency. That's what he says, right? And I think like that's not, it's maybe taking it a step further than what I'm doing now, but I'm just saying like that, having that open and just like free use and just that relaxed view that I see those UFC fighters doing in public with their millions of followers on social media and having no fear of anybody banging down the door and taking away their everything. Do you know what I mean? Like it's weird that in this day and age, like my view of the UK is like it's just that it's too archaic and how it all works like that, and it's epitomised in that cannabis stance. What you're talking about, the fact that you can have that bud in front of you and you can have a vaporizer, and that's perfectly legal. But if you just grind it, if you grind it anyway to put it in a vaporizer, if you just put it in a skin and light it instead, or put it in a vaporizer, now you're illegal. It's just,
it's an absurdity. I'll make a quick point on that, and then I've got a way to tie, I think, all of these in together in terms of response. It's ridiculous. It's one sentence. It's about 6 words, whatever it is. The smoking of cannabis is prohibited. It's on the bottom of the regulations. No matter who I talk to in terms of regulators, former heads of one of, if not the biggest UK importers, police, politicians don't want to fucking answer me. How are you going to enforce that? What happens if I tell you I've done that? I personally know where I got kicked off one of my prescriptions for doing so, for being too honest. But how do you enforce that? Does that Schedule 2 drug that's prescribed to me by my actions suddenly become one? Say if I got codeine and I smashed it up and snorted it, the worst that will happen is my doctor will remove my prescription. There's no criminal punitive measure for it because I had authorization under the prescription. Even if I chose to abuse it, there isn't a criminal sanction for it. So even if the police caught me doing that, they were then supposed to report me back. I have lawful possession of that product. So there's an absurdity there in terms of the illusion that they're presenting it to be something that it isn't. We've got test cases through Seed Our Future that are trying to understand this. We're trying to correlate this information and figure out how best to defend, because without throwing him under the bus, I'm not going to do it here. One of the heads of probably the largest prescribers in the UK said to me that they know openly 90+% of the people that have their prescriptions combust it, and they don't care. So there isn't an emphasis there. In terms of to tie it in of what you were saying about sort of Britain and being antiquated, I think our issue is we're so corrupt. People forget the power. Fiefdom may have collapsed around the world, but we fell back into an economic union. Obviously, that's, being torn apart little by little with places like Jamaica and the Caribbean nations, trying to get rid of the Queen, trying to stand as true independent nations and get rid of the association with the colonizers. But I think our House of Lords and our House of Representatives and the House of Commons, because of the corruption mechanism within that and the fact that we don't have sort of public representation in the same way they do in the States, means that we can never really follow the US. So I think what's happening is they're dangling the carrot of the illusion of what we're seeing across the pond, and we're going toward it going, oh, we can have that, when we know we can't. It's a different culture. It's a different economy. It won't fit in terms of the way it'll happen. We don't have citizen-led initiatives, so we can't get on the ballot and lead it. We have to then go through politicians and through APPGs and lobbying, etc. Very expensive, very corrupt. And as I heard this weekend, by one of the panelists, that we need to speak in a way and appeal to the politicians. And as I rebutted to the audience, they're supposed to be our public servants. If they don't serve us, get them the fuck out. Find somebody that will. That corrupt system basically means that whatever legislation is placed in power in the UK, and I think it will be a Tory like a conservative right wing economic limited nightmare. It's kind of similar to Germany in some ways. Installed here in the UK, and what will happen is that passes, and the MPs that were involved in that become the lords that will later block it. Our bills have to have a 3-point ascension from the House of Commons through the House of Lords, be voted on, sent back, and amended until it can go through royal assent. If the MPs that are then getting paid, and like Jackie Smith right now has a directorship or an advisor role for a medicinal cannabis company, and they then enter the House of Lords, guess what they're going to be paid to block? Any decriminalization, any descheduling, any reform to cannabis. And so I think the States is different. Their legalization, for all, I agree, I have issues with it as well. It's more corporate monopolies. But what you're seeing through individuals like this is they're not allowed to do that. That's activism. They're breaking the law and going, well, okay, how are you going to punish me? Take me to court and let's have this conversation. If you've legalized, how is it unlawful for me to do this? And these are the conversations that need to happen. Legalization is not the end of cannabis prohibition. It's the ring fencing of corporate monopolies to sell and produce cannabis to consumers as long as they do it in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference that we have in the UK of potential, although we don't have a citizens-led initiative, is we have such a culture and legacy that's going to do whatever the fuck we want anyway. We're building and building every year for all these issues in the vendor community and everything at the minute. A lot of drama, a lot of politics, all the usual kind of thing. As a general kind of consensus, the UK has some amazing growers. We have some amazing, knowledgeable people that are not interested in this legalized system. They're building their models. They're opening their clubs. They're opening their networks, and they're developing their brands and their genetics, and they're making a name for themselves. And I think we've got that fuck you attitude that I'm hoping, fingers crossed, is going to mean that we're not just going to roll over when they offer us some bastardized version of legalization.
Yeah. I mean, like one of the things I'd like to have on there was like with, how do I put this? With the I can't articulate it. If we had a system where basically piece by piece we lessen prohibition over time, right, it still gives enough room for exactly what you're taking, what you're saying, right, with the complete almost monopolization whilst it goes through the system, right? Mm-hmm. So, and it brings me to my point. As I entered this legal industry in 2020, they told me that, oh yeah, we're 5-10 years away from full decriminalised, fully allowed, anyone can buy it, whatever you want to call it, adult use, let's just say. They told me 5 to 10 years. I still hear that same time frame being quoted now. As you say, a dangling carrot at the end of something. My experience and, the little piecemeal step forwards that the APPGs and stuff have made I just don't think they're ever going to get to where, that end point that we say, oh yeah, in 5 to 10 years we'll have this. Boom. It's even taking out all the corporate greed that could help that get to that point. I just don't think British the British politics remains the way it is. I just don't think that's ever going to get through, because, as you said, little corners of monopolisation are just always going to exist, and they're just too ripe. And that's true. That's true in pharmaceuticals in general. Some of the horror stories and some of the things that have been now taken off the market after going through the 15-year drug discovery process and clinical trials and all that stuff, and they spent $1 billion on that single drug, and then it was allowed, and then 1 in 100 people get this severe symptom, 1 in 1,000 people get death symptom, and on it goes, and then they get to sell it for 7 or 8, 10, 12 years, and then just before the kind of it becomes open license, then it gets retracted or something like that all of a sudden because it's deemed too dangerous because of this or that. And that story is not unique in the drug discovery route. And yeah, that's just another, it's an
interesting one. It feels like to me, the companies that are involved in kind of the interstate battles, the international battles to own various nations, they're looking at Europe as a different thing. I think Europe's a cash cow for them. They want to go like America, like Cali went. They want a good window to exploit the patient, to get everybody onto it as a patient, to then use that veneer of respectability that it's medicine to get away with working out how to get it down to 1 cent a gram, how to exploit all the labor, and how to just make it the most profitable rather than the most beneficial. And what I see in Europe is, I personally believe from the people that I've spoken to, that Germany has been set up by the lobbyists for the medicinal sector in Germany, because Germany is the largest market in Europe and they're seeking to expand. And so the narrative that I have heard, and what I personally kind of am leaning towards, is that this system has been set up to pump it full of criminality. So there's so many arbitrary restrictions. The fact that you can't even carry a fucking ounce is a fuck you to the culture. You know what I mean? That's a standard weight in unit. It's mental, but that's going to then flood the market with then a need for, oh my God, all these criminals, all these gangs, all these unlicensed things, all this. This is why we need medicine. You're right. We should expand the medical market and that's controlled. That's safe. It's white collar doctors, with their lab coats. It's safe and clean, and it's toward the pharmaceuticalization of all cannabis. And I feel that we're just being used right now with the off-label prescription of flowers to correlate data sets that are then going to be used by, and when I'll go onto my GW thing in a moment, GW and other entities, because you've got to look at, again, where a lot of these companies are partnered with, who have been bought out. EMAC openly bought out Curaleaf. That doesn't mean they're the only international conglomerate to buy a majority stake in one of these entities. You've then got promissory notes, which is basically individuals making kind of shaking hand deals that when they can speak of it, the deal can come to light, sort of thing. So there's a lot of bullshit and fuckery, as we spoke of before, with them sitting on the fence waiting to drive that rec market. But it's all missing the truth. And the truth to me is, why should you get anything until we have been set free? I know it's a crude analogy, but I look at it as in ending the criminalization of homosexuality. And to me, it feels like, instead of then decriminalizing and removing all offenses for what you've previously, had targeting a certain subsection of society, you've gone, okay, now we're going to legalize homosexuality. And what that means is you can kiss your boyfriend between these hours. You're allowed to hold each other's hand twice a day. You can live together, but not in the same bedroom. You can, do you know what I mean? It's so, to me, it's so viscerally offensive. And I know people say that, it's little steps. It's like, no, then you've missed the point. Who is benefiting from that? Who profiteers? Who wins most? It's the money men. It's always the fucking money men when the little guy is still suffering. Cannabis from a tiny seed can make you a billionaire. Nothing else has this. It's the ultimate renewable regenerative resource. It is antithetical to capitalism, and that's why I feel capitalism needs to be the ones that control. It needs to be the system that controls any change in legislation around cannabis, and that's where they've come up with corporate legalization. They can benefit most from the financing of this, but restrict research and development, so none of us go, Why are you not making batteries out of all that sticks and stems? Why are you making HHC and THCP? Why are you going to have ULEZ and all these carbon taxes when you could just sequester the fucking carbon by growing trillions of plants? You know, why are we still using petroleum? You know, why are we using plastics? You know, still, why it's all these other things. Cannabis is the resource that sets humanity free if it's allowed to. She's the ultimate regenerative thing, as I've spoke of, and it feels like we're at this war, this to and fro, and they have the power of you know, generations of marketeers, of advertisers, of legal people, of economists, of politicians, of all professionals of all creeds that they've then infected with this money. And then they're going to just keep saying legalization, it's legalization, without allowing them to ever explore the idea of what happens then if you limit it to an ounce and I carry 29 grams. Oh, you're going to criminalize me, but you said you were legalizing. Is how, what?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and it goes back to another point, which I think there was, again, we're kind of flipping back and forth on what we were being picky here on what academic studies to promote and what ones to dismiss. But I'm sure there was something out earlier this year or maybe the end of last year that stated there was a controlled study that showed that smoking cannabis had no detrimental effect on the lungs. Didn't promote lung disease. It was again, it was controlled, and I think there was, I can't remember. Sorry, Simpa, I should have looked this up before I came on. I didn't know we'd speak about it, but anyway, by all accounts, it looks like it didn't have any detrimental effects to health. Mm-hmm. Now, I would tend to think that I agree with that. Like having smoked blunts for most of my consumption of life, when get put on prescription and tried an oil vape for the first time, I got on with it great to begin with, but then I started getting a sore throat and a sore chest, and then I started coughing with it. And I was like, that's weird. This is meant to be the healthy, safe way to do it. This is meant to be the doctor's approved, blah, 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 blah. And then in the meantime, this study comes out and says, well, there's no, you know, I think the other anecdotal thing to look at is anybody with any kind of lung disorders through smoking, there's nearly always been tobacco or other things smoked in there as well. We don't have a whole rack of data because people are too scared to say, right? All those people over years who smoked blunts and just kept it to themselves and self-medicated and never died of lung disease, you know. And again, I don't want to be falsely advertising that this is not dangerous to health, because you burn any plant, it's going to produce carbon monoxide, which is bad for your health. You know, the consuming anything that's burnt is going to do that. I mean, if you see any black on your toast, it contains carcinogens. Do you know what I mean? We can't avoid these things entirely, and to hide behind a bunch of these, you know, supposed health mitigating practices, like, you know, coming back to the vape and the smoking thing again, it just seems like, as you're now pointing out, another level of, well, you can have it, but only under these really tight parameters, which will allow us to keep all control of the thing. And just to make sure that people don't think we're conspiracy nuts here, you know, and you might be different from me, but I don't necessarily believe there's one big overpowering body that's just trying to sweep all this up and do it. It's not like that at all. It's much more opportunistic. It's much more grabbing a buck where you can, and it's not by design, but almost by, just repeat myself, opportunity, you know. And because that's what these guys who make portfolios for investments and, you know, try and get money for different enterprises do. They specialize in what will make money, not necessarily, you know, what's going to serve society or a community or allow us to move forward as consumers. You know, none of that stuff is, until you can find a way to monetize that. And that's what I'm very pessimistic about. Like, I do not see much change in the UK going forward. And, you know, I admire the fight that people like yourself have and continue to have. And, you know, but I get jaded really quick by the weight of it all, because again, to people like you and I, it just doesn't make sense, and it's hard to accept things that don't make sense, which is, you know,
which I think leads us on perfectly to GW, and hope by the end of this anecdote we have a good idea as to why we're in the position that we are currently in the UK. So you asked me about sort of GW and what I think are kind of its monopolistic practices. So there's a lot of stuff I can't speak to directly because it's somebody else's work. There are several people digging deep, and I mean fucking deep, into what happened between the early 90s and about 1996. And so a lot of things happened in terms of the creation of like hemp licensing, or as it's actually termed in the license itself, low THC cannabis cultivation. That then led to, or jump forward to California, kind of releasing the MMJ program, the so-called medical marijuana program. I'm air quoting for my listeners there. Obviously, you guys know me. I'm don't take those words with any great gravitas. But that then kind of kickstarted a thing around the world where various people went, holy shit, let's look at this thing. What's going on here? We were told that it was XYZ. How can this be anything more than this? And so, there's a Royal Commission commissioned here in the UK. I can't remember off the top of my head which politician it was that did so. And basically they went off to look around the world and look through sort of scientific data, any academic data and what they could find, and make an assessment of cannabis. And they basically came back and said, hey, this is a thing. We need to look at changing the law around this, making it much more accessible, creating research and development funded by the government. And we should allow for the creation of a private for-profit industry to explore these compounds and the potential future of cannabis. Flash forward a year, we're now in a year, about 5.5 months, and boom, GW appears. And GW allegedly, biggest allegedly ever, but I can't be asked standing to defend this in a court of law. But if I'm seeing myself, hi Simpa, I'm sorry I got you in this mess. GW operated without a license for its research and development until 2001. When the misuse of drugs regulations were created. They effectively keep in place every single aspect and facet of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. But what they do is create a small caveat that basically states that under certain strict licensing controlled by the Home Office, certain Schedule 1 drugs could be explored through research as to, potential therapeutic applications, industrial applications, etc. That was basically all the regulations did until 2018, when they added in there the Schedule 2 cannabis being scheduled. And I don't actually know what class it is under that schedule. That's something I should probably know. I don't know how they've quantified that, but it's Schedule 2 under the 2001 and still Schedule 1. And so that's where we get that juxtaposition of problems there. But basically, GW allegedly operated without this license. The rules then changed. They were then able to publicly start doing research and development into certain cultivars. There was a whole narrative around, I'll use your pseudonym rather than your real name, Sam the Skunk Man, and various of the notable characters that led to, GW holding some very interesting genetics, what is believed to be a modified, interbred, I don't know if it's actually been physically fucked with in terms of its genetics, but a version of skunk number 1, which is said to be unlike any other lineage out there in the world. I'm not sure what that means, having tried skunk number 1, but it's, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around it. But basically, obviously, they then went into creation of Sativex around sort of MS. We then had, at the same time, cannabis going down from a class B to a class C, still Schedule 1 under Labour at the time. This caused a giant headache to GW and others, because obviously cannabis awareness and consumption increased dramatically. This led to calls for decriminalization, legalization, different forms of law reform. And then somewhere around, let's call it 2004, not pinning it too hard, skunk psychosis becomes a narrative. Very interesting terms, given GW growing a cultivar called skunk. Skunk wasn't very popular of a term really until this genetic ended up being locked in a grow facility and research laboratory. And various pieces start appearing in newspapers and on, I was going to say state media. We don't have state media for all the BBC effectively is. Showing my inclinations there, sorry folks. But these narratives started to get pushed more and more of super skunk, super strong cannabis being dangerous, while at the same time skunk being quantified by Professor David Nutt, who I would still love to get on this podcast, but can't seem to get him to answer an email or message from me. He defines it as being less than 1% CBD, more than, was it 17%, 14% THC? Skunk would test higher than that in terms of the cultivar skunk number 1. And so it's an interesting juxtaposition that while one was being investigated for medicine over here, there was this narrative emerging that it's a dangerous drug. But then all of a sudden, Sativa lands on the market, and then through a lot of lobbying, it's available on the NHS. It's obviously incredibly cost prohibitive, but for certain individuals, private citizens, again, not going to go into some of the allegations and narratives about how that kind of came to be. But pressure was put on certain individuals to make that accessible for them and their families. And then, GW in that process, I think, gained 180. I can't read that page in my head. 180 something patents for everything from oral spray, sublingual, CO2 extractions, and they built this. And then all of a sudden, Hannah Deacon and Mike Barnes on one side of it, and Mr. Moore and Voltface, these two campaigns kickstart, and all of a sudden GW becomes that little bit more profitable, and a product that they've been working on, Epidiolex, is kind of allegedly rushed through certain testing and protocols, and it's brought to market. Then obviously we have COVID hits, and in America, at the height of it all, they managed to lobby the FDA and get it Schedule 5 in the States, so it's effectively over the counter, and they were charging $3,200 a year for the product. And so there's these juxtaposing things. And then obviously 2018, and it happens, and the law changes here in the UK. There's an explosion of interest, pressure on the Financial Conduct Authority and others to allow for money to flow in terms of investment and whatever else. And then GW start getting itchy feet. And lucky for them, Jazz decides to step in. And again, huge allegedly here. One of the narratives that I've seen emerging from fairly reputable sources, although again, this is just in discourse, not in actual, we studied the data, here's what we believe. But Jazz being oncologist specialists and GW having patents for cannabinoids and profiles of certain ratios of cannabinoids and terpenes being treatments for cancer, is quite beneficial to them. And obviously we have the Cancer Act in the UK in 1937, although the vast majority of that is retracted. There's still one line within it that basically states the advertising of cures for cancer that are not basically approved by the state is still a criminal offence. So it seems to be that they're kind of moving out of a limited market while there is this kind of new money. But I imagine GW just sitting there, Jazz and GW, or I suppose it's trading into Jazz these days, or they'll just buy up anything they see that they like, same as Canopy or Tilbury or anybody else. They'll let the little guys play and get their toys together and go, oh, we'll have that, thank you. And even then, again, above them, you've got your Vanguards, your BlackRocks, I suppose even the subsidiary of like Blackstone and that, they're all tied to the investment firms. I mean, you've got private holdings over in the States, you've got various firms and funds, some that were obviously connected to previous politicians' partners. And there's a whole narrative there that really emerges to, we are seriously corrupted, because they want to have their cake and eat it, basically. They want to be able to say it's a medicine when we sell it and we control it and we govern it, but it's a dangerous psychoactive drug that causes addiction, so that they can justify, stopping searches, they can justify over-policing, fucking violent raids, all these county lines teams that they're putting together and all this other shit that is effectively just taking down young entrepreneurs. Yeah, there are some human traffickers and some really fucked up people in this space that I agree. Let's get them the fuck out. Mm-hmm. But tarring us all with the same brush isn't going to fucking help. No.
And I think that the two biggest question marks for me over the whole GW story, and I guess, okay, not for legal reasons, but let's just look at the other side, not GW themselves, right, but who allowed them to be the sole license holder, which I believe is sole license holder for that enterprise for so long.
I think for 18 years they were sole license holder, something like that.
That surely goes a lot against monopolization laws and things like that, because you're basically giving someone the right to go, well, there's 18 years of a head start on everyone else. Meanwhile, then it brings me to the second point. I think between the acquisitions and the self-filed, I think there's over 210 patents.
Been a while, obviously, since I read that page, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that it may even be more since I read it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's just probably, wait. There's another one.
Yeah, so some of the detail in some of those patents were crazy. And here's the thing, Simpa, if Jazz decide to, and it looks like they might, there was one filed in the US, I believe, but if they start actually clamping down and trying to cash in on all those patents, the full industry could self-implode in some respects. Because they've actually, And it's again, it goes back to that other thing. Like in plant science, right? If you've bred like wheat, for example, to have a special resistance against the disease, right? And you've found the gene that's responsible for that, you can patent that gene for that use, right? Which I think patenting genes is fucking sketchy at best, right? But the kind of way that it's done is that, okay, so we discovered that this gene is useful for this, so we can patent that process. But if that gene is useful for something else, then we're not covered there, right?
Yeah.
You can argue back and forth, but it seems more fair than just being able to patent the gene wholesale, right? This is, again, who allowed one company to I guess, the patent's international probably, right? So it gets a bit trickier, but just the fact that if it was government funded and government initiative led, this whole GW thing, then why was so much patents be allowed to file? Because those things are bloody expensive as well, super expensive. And like, where was the money coming from to file all those patents in the first place? Do you know what I mean? And then, if, like I say, if they start now enforcing those patents, it could absolutely cripple the industry. And a lot of these guys who are in Canada and the US doing now what was once a black market trade legally, expert extractors and hash makers and, boutique growers and all these people, right? They could potentially all be put out of business again because these patents are enforced. And again, it just doesn't make sense to me why you would allow one company to have complete control and monopoly over that entire sector, that entire plant, which we now know is probably one of the most useful plants on earth, given its various compounds, its various uses, not just within the medical and health space, but also in textiles and material chemistry in general, from fire resistance and insulation all the way through to superconductors and all the rest of it. The plant holds an incredible range of potential. And just to give, just to know that one company who had a head start ahead of everyone else, at least in this country, have monopolised and just taken all these patents, something, for me, again, not blaming them for doing it, okay, just who allowed that to happen and why was it allowed to happen and why was other people who were trying, I know because they were there, I know people who were trying to get in the licensed space alongside and they were just laughed at. Practically, there were no responses. There was no, there was no way in, which is, again, and then, sorry, Simpa, jumping all over the place a little bit again, but I wanted to make sure we touched on this. I'm a big, what is regarded as hemp. In the UK, if you farm hemp, you cannot harvest the top third of the plant, the flowering tops, as it's called, which is criminally, just absolute criminal, debilitating on any farmer trying to do that compared to their European counterparts, for instance. I would love to see even just a way forward with that right now. I know the fight is bigger than that and it's not about piecemeal. I just feel that I want more hemp products. I use that term hemp loosely, but I want more hemp products available. It's something that I think is a material that we need more. It's, as you say, all the carbon capture, regenerative, long-lasting material, all this kind of stuff. Even if we just had some loosening in that respect, I would be happy as someone who's been in this industry 3 years. If I seen that change, I would be super happy with that on its own. That seems like a big milestone and much more achievable in my eyes than what we hope for. Overall, this conversation has been centered around basically, which is complete freedom.
Yeah. So I suppose to go to the GW thing, on paper, I suppose it's literally the Home Office. If you then want to really delve into it, there are certain individuals that are still in certain positions that were in positions when they started. There are trails that could be followed where people leave certain roles and go into other roles. Most of this is publicly available through Companies House, etc. I'm being deliberately quite vague, like I said, because there are others investigating this. But one of the narratives that, I agree, yeah, the monopolies thing is bullshit. That somebody has deliberately done what they've done. And it's almost a feeling that, no, we're looking into this. GW have got it handled. We've got a cannabis thing. They'll figure it out. And they've just kind of left it to the side. And I believe most of it is ignorance, but there are a few very malicious actors that have built their way into that system. And just for sort of the record, one of the founders, when it was sold, I think he made it was either 50 million quid or 60 million quid personally off the sale. I think it's $64 million was, I think, what his personal takeaway from the sale of that company was. Obviously, they had legacy investors and shareholders that had a much higher stake in the company, and everybody kind of got bought out as shares become other shares as they do. So you get bought out at market rate or a proposed rate. The proposed rate was market rate, which was exceptionally high for what it was. So a lot of people made a lot of fucking money. So they were quite happy with that to go down. On the sort of the hemp, air quotes, hemp thing, I agree entirely, except for obviously the usage of the word hemp. I think that is an impediment to the evolution of an industrial cannabis sector. We know from various sort of metadata analysis in American analysis of production in various states that the amount of biomass that can be produced from cannabis is in over an arbitrary level of THC versus, air quotes, hemp low THC under an arbitrary level. Is phenomenal in terms of its rooting capability, its detoxification of soils, its ability to, again, another thing of rooting is holding together ground bases. So it's incredibly useful, not just as building a resource, but in terms of waterway management, in terms of stopping desertification, deforestation, habitat and eco collapse, etc. So cannabis is wilding cannabis, I think, to me, is possibly one of the biggest things that humanity needs to look at doing. We've eradicated billions of plants that sequester 300. I mean, these are just on average THC producing plants. So it's 325 kilograms of carbon per ton when grown outside. Obviously, that varies in different areas, but sequestering that carbon and allowing it to die, reseed, go through hermaphrodization, go through natural sexing processes that cannabis will do to try and continue its lineage. And we end up with just carbon sinks. And so that deals with your carbon over one way, but that material would be too valuable in the, as you say, industrial so-called hemp sector. And that's not ever going to get to them being cannabis until you get rid of the drug value of cannabis. So everything is so interrelated that they're not going to allow for ubiquity of industry until they own enough of the industry. Nor would they ever allow for an honest conversation about what cannabis could truly do for humanity, because it's antithetical to patents and profiteering and CEO massive salaries, and there's something in the nature of cannabis that it won't allow it. We can grow it in our bedrooms, and evidently a lot of us can grow it better than the clinics that we've been provided product from. Yeah. It's an interesting thing, but I agree in terms of its usage. The last point I want to make on it is how much material are we currently destroying from home growers that could be made into clothing, homes, insulation, batteries, ethanol,
just biomass in general for exactly. And then the other point I always want to make on that is one of the species that that's actually copes quite well with monocropping. You know, they just growing the same thing in the same field over and over without replenishment. If you harvest the tops and leave the roots in the ground, if the soil's rich, the biome rich, those roots will serve the bugs, and those bugs will serve the next plants that's growing there. And that cycle is quite sustainable with, I mean, obviously bringing in some amendments will help maintain yields and stuff. There will be a linear decline, and if it keeps growing and growing and growing, obviously it's going to take more resources out of the ground than it can leave behind. I mean, you can't have a positive differential in that respect, but compared to a lot of the other crops, it does deposit a fair whack back out there. And, you know, if you've been anywhere, if they've grown where they recycle cannabis grown soil, right, without any amendments, if you watch what grows in that soil that's been, it's quite impressive. It's quite impressive. There was a couple of gardens I visited in California. They take their old big pots and then they put tomatoes and chilies and different peppers and things like that in them. Don't they just water them? And you should have seen these plants. It was unbelievable. And that's one of the other values of farming cannabis. It actually requires very little from the farmer. You can just grow it, and you know I think we've got a hemp shortage in the world. That's maybe a stretch in some people's minds, but ask people like Jamie Bartlett, who runs the Unite group and stuff like that. We could be doing with more available raw material, and as you say, there's so much of it discarded, and even on especially on the commercial scale, I've witnessed it with my own eyes. that companies that produce, tons upon tons per year of dry flower, and what happens to their waste? It's not used sensibly. It's generally incinerated.
Do you know why? I found out this when I was in Mendocino, and I pointed out to one of the farmers when we came out of his dry room, and he showed me this mountain in the distance. I went, what the fuck's that? That's our mulching pile for all our sticks and stems. And we started talking about all the myriad of different applications, and the guy just got madder and madder, and he was like, I am lawfully not allowed to touch that. They would take my license if I process air quotes hemp, because that pile would be air quotes hemp, whereas I'm licensed for air quotes cannabis. It's again the language, the arbitrary distinction. Like people have pointed out, I've got some of these giant hemp. What was it we call them? You guys call them hemp bricks. I call it concrete, because Hempcrete UK is a company name. So it's in the same way of like calling all vacuum cleaners Hoovers or Dyson. So, and that doesn't care what it's built of. I could have made that out of 25% THC. You definitely couldn't call that hemp. So I think the language, it restricts us, it limits us. And I think if we can liberate cannabis and all be proud to speak her name, because scientifically in the nomenclature, there is Cannabises, which is the family. From that, there is the genus of cannabis, which has the subgenus Cannabis sativa L. And then in that is Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, Cannabis ruderalis. So obviously there's a lot of different research or whatever being developed at the minute. But in terms of global consensus on the science and nomenclature today, that's where we stand. There isn't hemp, and hemp is, if I'm in Singapore, a bad example. If I'm in China and I'm looking at hemp, or if I'm then in Canada and looking at hemp, these are different plants, different expressions, and the arbitrary limit is different. In the UK, to 0.2, under 0.2, that's so-called air quotes hemp. I'm in Switzerland now, hemp's up to 1% THC.
Yeah.
It's all arbitrary, and the language, I think, causes us to end up getting lost. And I say this as a neurodivergent individual that can't help but be so fastidious about the language. And that's where I've got stuck for so many years in this, is I agree with 90% of what people are saying, but when they say it, I'm going to sound like those hippies that told me off in Glastonbury one time. Your words cast spells. Do you know what I mean? So we hypnotize each other through our language. And so when we reiterate this language in these sound bites, we give them new definitions in our imaginations that aren't true in practicality. So when we're saying to each other, we need legalization, we're hearing, end the war, I should be able to do what I want. When the politicians and the corporates that are part of these cabals of individuals that are controlling this hear that, they're like, jobs for the boys. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, do you know what? It brings me to a larger point that transcends cannabis completely, which is the overuse of averages and generalized metrics. Like now, so you can set a test. You go to school, university, whatever. You can do a test in geography. I mean, it's not exactly the highest level of question, but just say, what is the landmass of the UK? That has a square mileage or square kilometre metric that you can put down on paper, right? And you can get that question right or wrong depending on what you write down. If the number that you write down matches the number that they have, then that's correct, and you're deemed smart because you know the size of Britain, right? But the size of Britain's changing all the time. It's surrounded by coastline, which is constantly moving, right? We don't take into account the topology, and if we did, we have to draw a line under it because you can't take into account every blade of grass as you know what I'm saying? So at some point we've got to say, all right, and it's part of what we do now. It's a science-based, and I come from that background, right? So it's kind of weird that I'm the one bringing this out and criticising it. But the overuse of averages, the overuse of just generalising information, which is highly complex information being simplified for ease of use. Mm-hmm. Cannabis is the epitome of that, and hemp is a really good example of that. It's a way to generalize and reduce the complexity of something which is on a crazy spectrum, and just to draw arbitrary lines in the sand and say this is that and that is that, bang, bang, we'll work under that premise. Again, as we grow as a society and as we intellectualize going forward, because what people learned at college, 190, 50 years ago, you're now learning in high school, there's that, faster accumulation of knowledge thing going on all the time. So maybe what I'm looking for is something that's just maybe too we're as a society in our infancy to really work with that. But that's the reality of nature. That's the reality of the world. Nothing has a clear metric. But we can sit tests and get it right and wrong and be thinking, oh, he's smart and he's not, if you get that number right. But it's not actually a real number. It doesn't actually exist. It doesn't actually help anything except the fact that it's a measure of what you understand. And, just to bring it back to cannabis, that's what I think we're dealing with as well. We're trying to categorize and cage something which is true to its nature, even when it's being inbred to 6 and 7 generations, even when it's being scrutinized in the lab, it still tends to have its own personality, And I'll give a quick antidote on that, which I've told many people, maybe yourself before, but there's an experiment done in Canada. They took 25 identical clones which were derived from tissue culture, and they grew them in a tiny little environment, and they just turned them into flower real quick. And the idea was to measure the variance between the plants, right? When they looked at just the basic cannabinoid and terpene profile between these 25 genetically identical, derived from the same callus cell mass, and the same mini environment, they found high variance that no two plants were the same. Now, that's, for a genetic and biological standpoint, that's worrying, because how can you do any valid test with sensible repeats? But this is why cannabis has opened my eyes to this idea that not everything is a set metric. Everything has there's almost subjectivity in everything, because you have, like I say, with the blade of grass on the football field. A football field's 100 yards long by 60 feet wide or whatever it's meant to be. But if you take the topology of the grass in, now you can't do that sum. Even if we got an AI machine and it would somehow do a little bit, it would measure so much of it, and then it would average what the rest is. Count the amount of grass in 1 square centimetre and then do the maths, and then that'll be roughly what it is. But it's not what it is. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Unless you count every fucking blade of grass and then every little worm turd that comes out of there that changes the topology. Do you see what I'm saying? The surface area of that pitch alone is something we cannot grasp. But that is the complexity of nature, the natural world that we live in. And cannabis epitomises that. And I think, although you have to draw lines in the sand somewhere, I think we've done it far too early and far too upstream with cannabis, and hence why we still use the word hemp, because it does mean something, and it is useful to, because when I say to you hemp, you know what I'm talking about, and I know what you're talking about, even though I think we both, without saying it out loud, I think we both object somewhat to the term hemp, because it's just a man-made configuration of a THC level, essentially.
The thing with the hemp that really frustrates me is it comes to us through the Saxon, through the Proto-Germanic language, which comes ultimately from the Sumerians and means cannabis. So it's frustrating when people say like hemp cannabis, and you say it's like cannabis. And it's just it's good, for the people that then know. But what it also does is create an entire industry for people to grow cannabis, to trade cannabis, to produce products, to have an industry that, regardless of how much money they're making or whatever, they are not paranoid about the police. Their bedrooms are not getting raided. Their houses are not getting their doors taken off at 5 a.m. It's a different reality. And unless that is predicated on understanding and helping that other group, you are profiteering and taking advantage of prohibition rather than doing anything to cease it. So it's a deep source of frustration to me. It's an argument I'm going to keep fighting, because you know me. I like to have these sort of debates and discussions. But I agree, other than the word of conceptual, like I said, the vast majority of what is being said in that space, obviously the science suggests that if it was actual cannabis was allowed to not be as restrictive, we could produce far more products. But I understand how that then complicates the sectioning of the industry they've created. Because for me, cannabis is so multifaceted. It can't be pigeonholed into anything. As you say, the measuring of it, the expression of it is down to the fucking density of the atoms around it. I speak to breeders all the time, and no matter, we go through all the science and we're like, and then we arrive at a point of kind of looking at each other like, can we say this? And we're like, the other thing, what you're like, the love element. Because there's this thing. That's all you can describe it as, love or the energy and commitment in symbiosis that you have with that plant. It fucking adds something. It's not quantifiable by modern science, but man, when I've traveled the world and I've seen people's like big grows, and I'm like, yeah, it's all cool and that. I want to see what you grow. Like, take me to your little bit. You know what I mean? And when I go back to their crib in the show, whatever, and that's the one they've spoke to every morning. That's the one they've loved, they've cared about, they've tended to. And there's just more to it that even if you measured it, yeah, the profiles are similar or whatever, but there's a thing there.
Yeah.
You know?
It's two things in one. I think it's the attention to, you can only give your attention to so many individuals, right? If you're growing 4,000 plants, you can't give them the same attention as you're doing 4 plants, right? Yeah. And it's part of what I often cite as the problem with upscaling, which I've seen in the commercial market with people coming from the black market who had small basement grows or whatever, and then they try and do, a full-scale commercial grow, and it goes wrong many, many times over because it's a completely different management system, right? Growing that amount of plants is not the same kind of thing. It's a different job altogether because one of the things being is you can't give each of those 4,000 plants the same care and attention. And the second thing was bringing up Kyle Esplin again, chairman of the Scottish Hemp Association. But he's got evidence of, I think, let me get this right, hemp samples from the 70s with 1, 2, and 3% THC, and confiscated drug marijuana confiscated at the same time with 1 and 2 and 3% THC. Do you know what I mean? Which is just like, I think it says it all right there. It's it's what you said. It's not one thing. It's many things. And
if you look at the European list of hemp cultivars, hemp cultivars, low THC cultivars, most of them, this sounds stupid. Again, it sounds so weird in my head saying this. Most of them are cannabis. Obviously, they're all cannabis. But what I'm saying is most of them were cannabis that have been bred down. They're projects where they've worked together. They've found it's got a lower THC ratio. It works well in the environments they want to acclimatize it to. You do a little bit of work, basically stressing and working it down through interbreeding. And yeah, you can end up with a cultivar that'll express to what you want. But as soon as you remove those restrictions, or shit, even when you still keep applying them, the plant goes no. Like the number of people that get it done for hot crops, which is hilarious to me in terms of the terminology, not that people lose livelihoods and get fined and whatever else. But again, that speaks to why cannabis decriminalization. I mean, I'm an advocate for descheduling and decriminalizing and then creating a lawful regulated industry, the lawful regulated industry being everything that legalization provides, but not under that framework. I personally feel that everyone that already cultivates cannabis should be decriminalized and allowed to do it. There shouldn't be those offenses for the cannabis-related offenses of cultivation, possession, distribution. Because effectively what legalization does, like I said, it shits on the people previous. They don't get their life protected, but all these new consumers do. And it's just this hypocrisy of the way things go. I mean, how can we ever address the injustices of that, which has been, it's all well and good going, oh yeah, with cannabis roots was racism and classist and saying the token gestures. But do you actually understand what it means? Like you do, obviously, in terms of your youth, to see economies, microeconomies that only exist because of drug sales, to meet some of the nicest fucking human beings, most creative, most wonderful people locked into the worst socioeconomic positions, yet they will still tick you on for a month to keep see you by because they hate to see you fucking suffer. They'll never pressure you for it. They'll help set you up if you want it. They'll help connect you to other people. They are entrepreneurs. They are angels. They are individuals that are deemed to be unsuccessful because they don't want to make a fuck ton of money out of what they do. They just help people that land in front of them, and they're the ones I want to see recompensed first, rewarded first for their action, acknowledged first, so that when we write the history of the end of cannabis prohibition, it's acknowledged. Fuck writing me into it. I'm just a mouthpiece trying to bring the stories to the world, as it were. But there are people whose names will never be known, names that I can't speak on this podcast for respect for them, that need to be put in the history books, because fuck me, if it wasn't for them, none of this would be here.
Well, that's why most of those nearly all the modern genetics that we use and revere, they've all been bred in this crazy, illegal citizen science project. Do you know what I mean? They've all been, it's crazy how that's worked out, and it's given us such even though the gene pool is small, relatively speaking, the diversity in that small gene pool is huge. Do you know what I mean? Like it's insane. And I just wanted to hit back on that and bring us back quickly because unfortunately I'm to head soon. But
no worries.
Bring us back to the Durham thing, right? When I knew someone in Durham when I lived there, and he went round, right? And it was just interesting. He was an ex-student for the university that fell in love with the city, that like many of us do. And he stayed there, and he didn't use his academic achievements to work. I think he worked in Tesco to begin with, and then ended up having his own business and whatnot. But anyway, he at one point he just started to pull together a data sheet, right? And he showed me this data sheet, and he says, what I've done was I've just looked at, because Durham City is a kind of weird environment in the sense that the university has such a big influence on the city, and it's wealth that's there. Yeah, it's the city's rich because of the students, right? Which is a kind of win-lose situation depending on how you look at it. But anyway, what he'd done was he compiled a list of the cost in various different places in and around County Durham. So County Durham itself, even I think I forget all the names of the place, Thornley. It went down to Sunderland. He'd been around quite a lot of different places, and he got, what was the bloody name of the place, man? I've been away too long, Simpa. I apologise. I thought I was going to rhyme off a list of places there, but they escaped me. Anyway, but it was really interesting because what we seen was in the lower social class areas and the places that were more deprived, the cost of cannabis was significantly lower than it was in like say Durham City, etc. And that was to the tune of like almost half at the times. What they were paying for an ounce in Durham City at that time, they were paying for 100 quid, just by driving 20 miles south, which was just absolutely, well, and was it shocking? I think it was shocking to me because coming through from our teenage years, you always thought, oh, that's the price. Oh, the prices went up and now it's that price. And you just thought that was fairly universal. And but it's interesting because, that was like somewhere around 2016, 17, right? So before legalised, before medical was allowed. And it's just interesting that I don't think that's changed. I don't think that gulf has changed in that time, which is, again, I think it's testament to what you're saying. Those communities that have those players, they're not all crazy lunatic drug dealers running about with machetes and hitting people who don't pay them and all that kind of associated organised crime. Sometimes it's just people who fell in love with the plant and they share it with their people and they pay them for that privilege essentially to grow it. That's how it sometimes looks for the outside anyway. And that's what this chap who I won't name's observation was as well. He has I don't know if you mind me saying, he has a business which is food orientated, and he said for a long time he wants to put those two worlds together if it's ever if he's ever able to do that. And I think with the odd exception here and there though, I think you're right. I think a lot of these innovators and people in that space who are currently serving their communities, they'll be, I don't know what they'll do after, if it becomes dispensary based and big corporation based, and hopefully they maintain a black market like they did in Canada, which seems to be, I don't know, a good thing, because here's the thing that's never really spoken about the black market side of things, right? It's a self-regulating system. The people who are buying will not tolerate drops below certain standards, right? And that's why you get, and when I was growing up, there was lots of talks about organised gangs from the Chinese community, for example, in Glasgow. They would bring in illegal immigrants to basically live in houses which were entire farms. And I know that there's a lot of issues with Albanian-based growers in England as well right now. And those are not what I'm talking about here at all. That is the organised and the kind of bad side of things, right? This is what you were saying. It's the individual people who have an initiative, and that is going to be taken away, I think, if and certain as things unfold the way that it's unfolding, bit by bit, and as you say, squeezing every dime out it. Because look what happened in the US, where guys who were producing a pound of cannabis, let me get my numbers right. They were getting $2.5 grand for it, 2017. Now you're lucky to be getting between $250 and $500 for the same amount. You know,
depending on where it's coming from in terms of if it's light deprived, if it's outdoor, etc., that's down into the hundreds. A larger wholesale. All that does is that promotes those individuals to sell it as a brand outside of the regulated market. And I think the UK will continue to do what we've done and will do that. I don't think it'll harm the so-called black market, unregulated market. I think it will increase it, as we've seen everywhere, because once awareness comes up, people go to the dispensaries, try whatever, and they go, this corporate shit, it's soulless, it's empty, it's vapid, it's void. I want to go to the guy who really grew it and hear the stories and learn about the culture and the heritage and dive into it. Cannabis is far more than the action of consumption. Do you know what I mean? There is a whole community, subculture that, again, needs to be honored, that you cannot corporately replicate. You have to allow there to be legacy. I mean, they are in America with some social licensing, etc. But you still need to gain capital and everything else. That means effectively you lose control. But in terms of the Durham thing, probably been a lot of my mates because there's a general thing up here. Because of that, the students get preferential treatment. If you're caught in the city with a drug and you're a student, they take the drug off you. You go back to halls, no problem. If you're a local, you get in trouble for it. And it created this real disparate divide between the communities. And yeah, it meant that if you you knew the grower or you knew the guy, it'd almost be the way you present, how you sound your voice. Is it a rah and yah? And that kind of, as you will have heard for many years in Durham, that overly indulged, heavily, posh, tough kind of. Yeah, it's a fake accent, effectively. I mean, not some people talk to certain degrees of it, but I've heard you all drunk. I hear you when you let it slip. But yeah, so this is that sort of thing. But as you say, self-sufficiency, people will always choose to do it. And actually, even though we've seen the hydro industry get decimated under legal regions, there is a thriving community of people still sharing this knowledge and information, and we'll continue to work together and share what we can. Yeah, there'll be con men, and yeah, there'll be other people entering the space. There's just one final point I want to bring up from before, and then I'll let you go. And I've instantly forgot it. God damn it, I was doing so well. Something you said earlier about... Nah, it's gone. Whatever.
I was going to say we can chat another minute to see if it comes back to you if you like. Because the other thing I'm going to ask you is that I've been away from Durham for almost 6 years now. And I was going to say, when I was there was the constable the chief constable had a very relaxed view on self-consumption and even self-home grow. Is that still kind of the case up there, or has it changed?
Unfortunately not. I have a video on my YouTube channel that still gets quite a few views that I call an introduction to cannabis policy in Durham. I think I need to do an update on that because unfortunately Ron died, who was our PCC. Mike Barton, who was our chief constable, he retired about 6 months after. The new individuals in charge are the ones leading the call to ban nitrous oxide. They're seeking more funding for antisocial behavior and declaring, cannabis consumption to be antisocial behavior. They're kind of betraying the legacy of what, Ron and Mike did. They did some amazing work in terms of helping out with heroin-assisted treatments, dealing with certain brothels and sex work, and what they did around drug consumption and everything else. That they created the checkpoint diversion scheme, now used by, I think, 9 out of 43 constabularies. It's a shame where we're at in Durham. We led the charge for a long way, and I thought... the police got it, and this is the final point I'll make for anyone out there. It's the police have a lot more empathy than you think. Not your average Bobby on the beat. They, no offense to them, don't necessarily have the capability to comprehend the complexity of these arguments. But a lot of the chief constables and that, they start to understand that it's far better to let home grow happen, to let home dealing happen, because that money stays here. The Albanians, the Triads, any other organised entities. We have Russians, you got Vietnamese, you got all sorts of people. The vast majority of that money leaves the country. If we have corporate legalisation, where do you think all that money's going to go?
Yeah,
to the Caymans. It's if you want to help, as you see the guys that were selling, we used to call them Swifties, 750s. Just like a 16th of taco hash, and they would shot them on street corners and that, and on bikes, and they were paying for their kids to have dinner that night. that'll always have to happen because the system under legalization will not give them a job in a dispensary or in a clinic or in a grow room because, no, man, my accent and that, like, they present wrongly to the establishment. Ooh, lower class. Ooh, uneducated. Ooh. Yet some of the people who sound the roughest, fuck me, they would put academics to shame that I know. Like, it's insane.
Well, it's funny because I'll share a quick anecdote before I go. Is that when I was studying at Glasgow, I had a couple of jobs, like paying my way through, and I always made the snapshot. I was working in the Marriott in the bar, right, which is quite a highbrow bar, but it was the only one I could get that suited my hours to keep me studying. And what was interesting is the snapshot of people there versus the snapshot of people when I was at Durham doing my PhD. And so all the cohort I was in, everybody's doing a PhD. If I compared those two groups intellectually, I could see no notable difference, none at all. There was nothing that stood out in any way. Like, sometimes you talk to people and they're very good at passing exams or they're very good at remembering passages of information, and that's what got them to where they are. But the ability to think, create your own arguments, create your own visions, even creatively, like that's what I think is the bottom of intelligence, actually, Simpa, is unleashing your creativity, because it allows your brain to work in new and wonderful ways to acquire the knowledge it needs to get to the next point. So if you're highly creative, don't let anyone tell you that you're not intelligent, because that is not the case at all. Intelligence comes from creativity, in my opinion, and being book smart and learning passages and information and reciting them doesn't necessarily make your intelligence, but your ability to think is what makes you intelligent. So my antidote is these two different cohorts, no notable difference in terms of the intelligence as far as I could observe. Really, what it was just different lines of inquiry and different achievements and different skill sets. But for some reason, society awards all these people with pieces of paper which say that they are supposedly the smart ones in the room. Do you know what I mean? Which is just not always true. It's definitely not always true. And I was actually disappointed because I was sweating going into that environment, coming from a working class background, thinking, shit, how am I going to keep up with these people? And then it turned out, all right, they're just normal people like everyone else, and there's no actual, step up in anything. There's not. And that's where we're at. And so just to your point, people who have a funny accent, or, I certainly have a much softer accent now than I started off with when I moved out of Scotland. That was more just to get by and not have to repeat myself so much. But no, your point is true, man. If you go too far into that side of things, you're immediately judged by the other groups as being, inferior in some way, which is just lunacy. Because some of the most innovative and crazy out the box thinking has come from those communities.
100%. 100%. I think that's a wonderful place to end this podcast. I got one question in to my notes, so going to have to get you back on again in the not too distant future, brother. And we'll continue this conversation. But I thoroughly enjoyed it and greatly appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, let's make this part 1 of 2 then. I'm quite happy because I think we still got quite a few things that we never got to, and I can see the sun's pushing me further back here with my stripy blinds. So yeah, a good place to end it. But yeah, let's arrange to do a part 2 soon, and we can get to the rest of those questions. I'm sure at this rate we'll get, probably be a 4-parter to get through those questions. But the more the merrier. I think it's been refreshing. Like I said, I've been looking forward to coming on for a while, and it's certainly not disappointed. Thanks for your efforts, man. Like, people that you absolutely needed in these kind of movements. That you are the pioneer, you are the frontline fighter, as it were, and we appreciate that vastly, because not all of us can do that, and not all of us are willing to do that. So kudos, man. I hope you take time to appreciate what you've achieved in that respect, because you've found your voice and you've shared your opinions, and I find them to be most uplifting and inspiring, because they're closer to the truth than sometimes you get from organised industry. Let's just say.
I greatly appreciate that. I really do, brother. And thank you. It's been a pleasure. We'll get part 2 in the diary before too long. I'll let you get off before you get guillotined by that ray of sunlight. It's been awesome, brother. Thank you for taking the time.
Likewise. Cheers, Simpa. We'll speak soon.
Cheers, brother. I'll do some housekeeping, so I'll let you exit.
Okay. Yeah.
Speak soon. Peace. Bye.
Cheers, buddy. Bye-bye.
Well, there you go, folks. That was Dr. Gary Yates. I know I say this every week, but I did thoroughly enjoy that conversation. We covered one question. I think actually some of these we kind of did touch on, like the hemp myth. We talked about some of the issues around academic data and sort of the scientific literacy. Didn't get onto actually what he does in any of his roles. Wanted to discuss more actually of his time in Durham University. Interesting to get sort of an outsider's view on the city. Maybe actually a conversation I should have privately. I'm just curious, you know, I've lived here most of my life and I love this little city. And I've had my fair share of issues with the students and the student population. So to actually be able to discuss with somebody that I respect in the space about the history of their time in Durham, I think would be quite beneficial to me personally. Maybe not you guys. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you want me to ask him about his time in Durham Uni. Yeah. Thank you if you've made it this far. I know it's quite hard to get through these podcasts. I do like long format. I find it's the best way to get a raw and authentic conversation, and that's our tagline these days. But it's true. I want to understand people, why they operate in these spaces, what their beliefs are, what their truth is, what they've come to find, so that I can learn from them and we can learn together. We can understand, you know, why certain things are the way they are. Yeah, just wanted to say thank you again to everyone that came to Product Earth for supporting the stall, for supporting the stand, for every listener that kind of came and said hello and said that they appreciate my work. Again, it means the world to me. As I think I've said in the past, like this little room. I'm trying to keep my sweat stains down because it's quite warm. But this little room where I can touch all four sides from sitting in this chair can often feel like a prison cell of my own creation. So to know that my self-flagellation, it's an interesting way of putting it, and my sort of, I guess, sacrifice and my persistence and obsession in this space isn't going unheard, isn't going unappreciated. So again, thank you all so much. We'll wrap up here, folks. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, please do give us a like, a share, subscribe. I don't know what else you do on various other platforms. I think you can subscribe on Spotify these days. I think a couple of hundred of you already do. So yeah, on any platform, give us a rating, give us an honest review of what you think. You know, take a couple of seconds if you don't mind. Just tap it out. Yeah, I appreciate all your feedback as always. I appreciate all the support. If you really want to support the channel, do check us out, the channel, the podcast, the whole project I've got going here. Check us out on patreon.com/the Simpa Life, where for less than a cup of coffee a month, you can keep this little project of mine going. I mean, I'm gonna keep it going anyway, but to not run it at a deficit would be beneficial. Yeah, all social media platforms at the Simpa Life. I'll be doing a write-up on simpalife.com for the event. And yeah, I'll share the videos when they become available from the panels from last weekend's Product Earth. Yeah, we'll be back next week with a guest, somebody. It'll be fun. You'll enjoy it. I'll enjoy it. And we'll hopefully learn some new shit together. All right, folks, you've been beautiful. Take it easy. Peace and love.